At number 10, cutting fingernails. Each civilization had their own specific beliefs, religions, and rites. For the Vikings, their belief in Norse mythology impacted a lot of their daily lives and even their burial rituals. One specific prophecy from their religion depicted the end of the world, and as anyone would, they tried to avoid that at all costs. In Norse mythology, Ragnarok was their version of the end of the world, and during this event it was foretold that a lot of stuff was gonna happen, like giants and demons approaching and attacking the gods, and a ship called Nagfar would carry a fleet of giants. This ship was said to be made of the fingernails and toenails of the dead, and the bigger the ship, the more giants would come. Out of fear of this happening, the Vikings took every precaution to prevent Ragnarok and subsequently the arrival of this fingernail ship. To do this, the Vikings built into their burial rites a very important step, cutting the fingernails of the dead. The Vikings had to remove the fingernails of the dead so that they couldn't be used to build the giant ship, but other than their removal, no one really knows what they did with said fingernails. The Vikings were also said to have kept their own fingernails clean as to prevent the same outcome. At number 9, teeth filing. Many civilizations had body modifications as part of their culture through time. Mesoamerican civilizations were known to shape their skulls and alter their eyes, women in China altered the shapes of their feet for many years, and so many cultures around the world adorned themselves with tattoos, piercings, and scarifications. In Viking culture, their body modifications often included dental work. Evidence suggests that some Vikings filed horizontal lines into their teeth, and some of them filled those grooves with red dye to make themselves look even more terrifying. Because the Vikings were known to be voyagers traveling the seas to new lands, some anthropologists believe that the Vikings may have picked up their idea for dental modification after making contact with people in West Africa, as many tribes over there were known to file their teeth into different shapes. Would you guys ever do something like this, or would you rather leave that up to the Vikings? Now before I continue telling you guys about the weird and crazy things that the Vikings did, let me first ask you guys to leave a like on this video if you're enjoying it so far, and maybe also consider subscribing to the channel to see more awesome videos like this one. At number 8, carbon monoxide. The Vikings were pretty good builders, mainly of ships. Their ships were huge, intricate, and very impressive, but where they excelled in shipbuilding, they lacked in the construction of their homes and community buildings. Apparently, the longhouses that they built for their communities were actually pretty unsafe to be in and trapped a lot of toxic gases inside of them. Researchers from a university in Denmark recreated one of the Vikings' longhouses and lit a fire in the center of it, like the Vikings would have done back in the day. After simulating an average living environment and monitoring the atmosphere inside of the longhouse, they realized that there wasn't enough ventilation to prevent carbon monoxide and nitrogen dioxide from building up inside. This would have led to a lot of people getting sick, especially those who spent long periods of time inside. The Vikings didn't know that though, but they also had their own remedies for curing sickness, so I don't think that they would have thought much of it.
Number 7, outlawed. This one is kind of interesting. So oftentimes when choosing the punishment for a criminal, it came down to fines, banishment, and outlawing, and a lot of times all three. Outlawing went hand in hand with banishment. In a nutshell, it means you are no longer protected upon the laws of the land. So should someone maybe want a little revenge, there's not much you can do. Should have committed that crime there, cowboy. Like I said before, this was oftentimes done to those who were banished, so not only were they tossed out of the village, but also not protected by the village anymore. Pretty much leaving the criminal to nature and whatever she has to offer. And we all know Mother Nature, she can be a little rough sometimes. Whew. Number 6, rodeo. If you're gonna be dumb, you gotta be tough. This world is rough, if a man's gonna make it, he's gotta be tough. Wise words from a trailer park supervisor. Huh? This one is just crazy, stupid, and violent, so strap in folks. There was a trial, or a way of passage, if you want to call it that involved Grease, a cow, and a criminal. You take the angriest cow in your herd and you grease its tail up like a fat dude whose thighs have been chafing all day at a water park. The crook's hands would also be greased up. The cow was given a not too PETA friendly poke from a farm tool, and the idea was while the cow was rightfully mad, kicking, stomping, and mooing, the crook would have to hang on for as long as possible. If he did and didn't let go, then there was no charges. If he did fall off and slip and let go, then well, so long von Schlorgenbergen Foreman or Ulfric. That's a Swedish name or something, I think, I don't know. Number 5, meat hook. Sometimes when given fines, it wasn't always cash value that was taken. Sometimes if the crime was heinous enough, the evildoer's property and items were taken instead. Well, sometimes folks didn't like having their stuff taken, which makes sense, they put up a fuss. No one likes their stuff getting taken. Just ask George Carlin, he knows a lot about that stuff. Everybody loves their stuff. In order for authorities to take possessions from the convicted, they would slice their ankles open, which, just talking about that makes me sick. And then for good measure, tie them up and suspend them from the ceiling from a beam in their house. No, not unaliving them, keeping them very alive, just severely hindering their movement and ability to say, hey, get your hands off my limited edition Obi-Wan Kenobi Lego set. That one's mine. Number 4, tree hugger. I hope you folks at home aren't eating during this video. It's about to get a little Mortal Kombat in here, if you will. Even though I watch videos when I eat. Carpet cleaning videos, anyone? Where's my lunch? You know what I mean? I do weird things like that. I don't know. The second most horrible sentence the Vikings could bestow upon their criminals and dredges of their society involved a tree. I'll get to the first one later, it's pretty heinous. It involved a tree, a knife, and a squishy rope. Squishy rope? What? Yeah, I'll get to that. Trees being great symbols of Norse mythology and culture, it made sense to do this here. Shout out to Yggdrasil. Oh, cool stuff. You take your perpetrator and you carve open his belly like a high school jack-o'-lantern contest, and you pull his intestines out, and you keep pulling them out till you've got enough to wrap around the tree. And you basically tie him there. Except you don't wrap him around the tree, he walks himself around the tree until he's out of string, like a sick yo-yo. Oh, gross. This was extremely painful and not quick at all, as humans can live for a couple hours without their squishy rope inside their belly. Not to mention it probably attracted wild animals for a quick and easy meal. Not a good way to go. Don't recommend that. That's sick. That's twisted.
At number 3, house bears. Humans seem to be pretty good at domesticating animals. We domesticated dogs by accident, and now they're considered man's best friend. We domesticated livestock for food and other purposes. We domesticated horses to be our transportation and carry things. So we kind of know our way around animals and could probably make anything into our pet if we really wanted to. But the Vikings weren't just satisfied with dogs, horses, and livestock. They were the mighty Vikings and they needed mighty pets, and that's why they kept bears as their companions. Yes, bears. Now don't get me wrong, the Vikings also had normal pets like dogs and cats, and they would even sometimes bring them along on their expeditions, but they also really liked bears. It is said that when they weren't out laying siege to someone's town or sailing the seas, the Vikings would visit bear dens and take bear cubs home with them. They would then raise the cubs as house bears. But having a house bear was also a very big responsibility. You had to make sure that your bear was kept in check at all times, so that meant no eating people or livestock, no disturbing your neighbors, and if your bear did get into trouble, you would either get hit with a fine or be banned from having a house bear. So maybe it's best to stick with normal pets like dogs. At number 2, worthy kids. The Vikings were ruthless even when it came to their spawn. I mean their kids. These guys were really picky when it came to having a family because they weren't afraid to just yeet their kids if they didn't like them enough. Back in their day, when a baby was born, they would christen their kid with a name during a ceremony called Asavatni, but only after determining if this kid was even worth raising in the first place. You see, when a baby was delivered, the child would be placed on the ground for the father to then pick up and examine. He would be looking for any physical deformities, disabilities, and to determine if the kid was actually his or not. He would decide if the kid had a future. If they did, then they would hold the Asavatni ceremony where water was sprinkled on the kid's head and given a name, and if they weren't worthy, then they would be left outside in the elements and abandoned. And finally, at number 1, criminal profiling. It turns out that the Vikings kind of invented criminal profiling. You see, when the Viking horde would set off to battle, there was no telling how they would return. You have to remember that these guys were bloodthirsty and violent, and there was no telling what was going on in their heads. I mean, don't even get me started on the whole berserker rage thing, because that itself is very intense. But basically, when the horde would return home, they seemed to have caused a lot of problems because many of them couldn't turn off their rage and would just wreak havoc on the town. To deal with this, it is said that a series of Icelandic sagas were written as a sort of profile to warn the homegrown Vikings of what to look out for when the others would return. They had to kind of alter their stories a little bit because if they were too specific, then it would have caused people to learn to be afraid of basically any Viking man, so they had to keep things a little generic, but for the most part, people learned to stay away from those who couldn't turn off the berserker rage at home in order to keep themselves and the rest of their community safe.
Starting our list off at number 10, the disappearance of the Norse. Norse mythology is fascinating yet mysterious, of course. They settled in Greenland around 1000 AD, and they settled for over 400 years, and then just like that, they disappeared. But not without leaving their mark first. Vikings invented hockey, they skied, women had a large amount of rights compared to what we usually see on this channel, right? That's a given. But one of life's greatest mysteries is where Greenland's Vikings went. Like I said, they disappeared, right? The only remains that are left are crumbling church walls that were used for not even 500 years. This is baffling. Archaeologists are still unsure of what happened to the Norse population. Maybe it was a plague, maybe it was the Inuit, or perhaps they settled back in Europe. Again, it's really hard to tell. Recent excavations provide hints that they settled in the West, most likely relying on trade to survive. So maybe they followed the goods and then they left naturally. Who knows? They used to call hockey nataliker. That's all I know personally. So
in our number 9 spot today, we have the creation myth. Going right back to the beginning of things, the Norse believed that the universe emerged from an empty space separating the world of ice and fire. The first creature to come into being in the Norse creation myth was the giant called Ymir. He is said to have been born from the moment the fire from Muspelheim and the ice from Niflheim met in the abyss of Gunningaga. Ymir had the ability to conceive asexually, and his offspring spontaneously sprang from his armpit sweat and his legs. This is how Ymir became the mother and father of the Jotuns, who would later go on to become the enemies of the Norse gods. But eventually, Buri came into existence. Buri went on to have the grandchildren Vili, Ve, and Odin, we all know Odin, who decided to create the world and fill it with life. But unlike the Christian ideals and concept, the Norse deities couldn't just create life out of nothing. So naturally, they just killed Ymir and made the world out of his body. The sky was made from his skull, his brains became the clouds, his blood turned into the oceans, and his teeth were mountains and rocks. This gave even more power to the three brothers, who then gave life and intelligence to humans. This creation story is thought to have really influenced the way that the Norse saw the world. They were living in a universe that was only made possible by death.
Number 8, Norse or Viking. You may have asked yourself during this video already, or at some point in your life, what is the difference between Norse and Viking? I watched Norsemen and now I want to bark at dogs. That's my new dream job, just to bark at people all day, I guess. Norse and Viking both referred to the same group of people who both settled in Scandinavia in the medieval times. Now this all happened again around 1000 AD. The Norse are Norsemen, right? Guys who bark at dogs, you know, all that kind of stuff. The Vikings are also Norsemen, but they're just a little younger and a bit more, a bit more energetic. A lot of this, a lot of height, you know what I mean? The Vikings were seafaring warriors, while the Norsemen were involved in farming and trade and that sort of stuff. So there you go. Now you know the difference.
At number 7, onion soup. Speaking of Viking home remedies though, they had some pretty interesting ones. Every civilization had their own takes on medicine and healing their sick and injured, and the Vikings were no doubt the same. For them though, soup was their tool for healing, and for x-rays. Sort of. These days we eat soup when we're sick to warm up our bodies and balance out our sodium levels, and doctors have actually proven that eating chicken soup actually does make you feel better when you have a cold, but Vikings didn't really have the same idea. For them, onion soup was their thing, and they used it to diagnose people. Viking healers would make up a pot of really strong onion soup and feed it to a warrior who had a wound around their abdomen. Once the person drank the soup, the healer would see if they could smell the soup through the wound. If he could, then the wound was fatal and there was no sense in trying to save the person, so they would just move on to the next warrior. It saved the healer time trying to attend to everyone, but it kinda sucked for the person who got left behind, because not only are they not going to make it, but their last meal was that awful onion soup. At number 6, Blood Eagle. We all know that the Vikings were a ruthless group of people, but their methods of execution really painted a clear picture of how terrifying these guys were, and how they had a colorful imagination when it came to imagining new ways to unalive somebody. The Vikings came up with a method of execution called the Blood Eagle, and yes, it is just as terrifying as you would expect with a name like that. The Blood Eagle basically involved cutting someone up to make it look like an eagle. They would cut apart the rib cage and then spread it apart to make it look like wings, and then after that, while this person was still alive mind you, they would pour a salt solution over the wound, pull out the lungs, and arrange them over the rib cage to, again, make it look like wings so that this person could flutter away into the afterlife. Now the mysterious part of all this is that historians aren't exactly sure if this was actually a real method of execution or if it was just embellished in Viking records to make them sound cooler. I for one hope that it wasn't actually real because that sounds brutal, but when it comes to Vikings, you never really know. At number 5, building fires. The Vikings were some pretty innovative people, but they were also kinda gross. This gross behavior applied to a lot of things, but one of those things was their fire building. Now you're probably asking yourself, Brie, what's so gross about making a fire? Well, it's the way that they started the fire that was kinda grody. You see, nowadays we have a bunch of things that we can use to start a fire. We have matches, lighters, lighter fluid, and a bunch of other things, but obviously back in the days of the Vikings, they didn't have those fire starting tools, and so they had to improvise. The Vikings came up with a nifty little trick to start a fire where they took a fungus called touchwood and they would beat it and burn it until it turned into a thin, flat thing that kind of looked like felt. Then they decided to get gross and would then boil the touchwood in human urine because urine contained sodium nitrate, which would help the touchwood turn into something that would smolder rather than burn. They could then take this stuff with them and use it to start fires whenever they wanted so they could cook food over their urine-fueled fire. Sounds delightful. At number 4, conning. Conning people has been something that's kind of been part of many societies since probably the dawn of civilization. Anyone can con anyone into doing anything or buying anything. I mean, people do it on eBay all the time. But apparently, the Vikings were also known to con people probably for their own enjoyment, because they're Vikings. Back in the day, the Vikings would do trades with the Inuit people and they would acquire narwhal tusks from them. The Vikings would then sell those tusks to other people, marketing them as unicorn horns, and let's face it, no one's gonna turn down buying a unicorn horn. Because of the Vikings and their conning ways, by the Middle Ages, people not only believed that unicorns were actually real, but that they also had magical powers. So in a way, if you were obsessed with unicorns as a kid, you can thank the Vikings for that.
In our number 3 spot today, we have Niflheim. This is a type of hell that comes from Norse mythology, and rather than being a fiery pit like a lot of us think of when we think of hell, it's actually a frozen landscape. This place is ruled by Hel, who is the goddess of death and the daughter of Loki. It is actually believed that her name might be where the name for the Christian underworld came from. I feel like I mentioned Christianity a lot in this. I don't know why. It's just a coincidence. Niflheim is located next to the shore of corpses, which is where Nidhogg lives. If you're wondering who that is, it's of course only the giant snake that feeds on the dead, because why not, I guess? There are said to be 9 worlds in Norse mythology, and Niflheim is the deepest and darkest one. It is said that souls are brought here by Hel's messenger, and from here the souls are simply just kept in constant pain.
Number 2, go Berserk. Unlike the fancy horned helmet, Viking berserkers were real. That part was historically accurate. And let me tell you, these guys specifically, they were terrifying. These Viking warriors would arrive to battle decked out in bearskins. Now the term originally meant to change form, right? Berserker, to change form, transformers, right? All the same kind of combat. So they were emulating a bear while walking into combat. Imagine being the other guy, you'd be scared shitless. Berserkers were considered a higher power when it came to battle. Yeah, no shit. They were the big dogs, or more accurately as they were described back then, mad dogs. More often than not, berserkers could take an opponent down with one single strike. How did they do it, right? Besides having a large build naturally, how did they win so many battles? How were they relied on so often? Today we have an idea of what may have helped aid the fight, and it's bad stuff. It's all illicit substances. Yeah, they would just do some not so great stuff and then run into battle screaming, hopped up on something. The odds that berserkers were on something going into every battle, those odds were pretty high. They're pretty high.
In our number 1 spot today, we have Ragnarok. Also known as the Doom of the Gods, we can't fully appreciate the new god of war without really knowing what this story is portraying to some degree. Ragnarok would have been the most feared word for the Norse, or perhaps a word that changed their outlook on the world. This was a fate that no one, not even Odin, could escape. At the time, there was a belief that there were different ages, the axe age, the sword age, the wolf age, so on, before the world would fall. There would then be 3 years of absolute chaos that included famine and sickness, and following this would be an all-out war in the heavens. This war would see the gods facing everything: Jotuns, giant wolves, giant serpents, and most importantly, Loki, who broke free from his chains and was ready for revenge. This fate saw the fall of the gods, and the fire giant Surt burned the entire world to ashes, killing almost every living thing. While this is a super depressing fate to believe the world will meet, there was a glimmer of hope. After Ragnarok, there was rebirth. It was believed that a new world would arise from the ashes.
At number 10, non-stop party. What is the longest amount of time you've gone out to party? A couple hours, maybe a weekend? Well, I don't think it could ever compare to how long the Vikings partied. The Vikings would have probably had a good old chuckle if they knew our parties only lasted a few hours. They'd be like, ha, look at these weaklings. Anyway, these guys could probably out-party anyone. Their biggest festivities, like the ones held after large expeditions or for weddings, would typically last for days, but their major feasts, like the ones they would use to celebrate the winter solstice, may have lasted upwards of 12 days. Now that's a lot of party stamina. I would probably need about 50 Red Bulls to even try and keep up with these Vikings.
Number 9, actual really good food. Like pretty decent food. If you're a foodie, then I do have some good news for you. The Vikings were apparently like pretty decent cooks. For the time anyways. They stocked their parties with roasted meats like poultry, horse, and beef, with platters of greens, fruits, and buttered vegetables. Beer, ale, mead, and fruit wines were the common beverages, and heavy drinking was encouraged. Not unlike bars today, where there's always that one person who keeps secretly buying tequila shots for everybody, and then you're like, okay fine, I'll take it because I don't want to be rude, you know what I mean? Anyways, considering the fact that parties would sometimes last for weeks on end, having a lot of food in their party hut was super important. They needed enough to last them until the partying was done, which who knows when that would be.
At number 8, rap battles. Every party has to have some kind of activity, right? I mean, yeah, we can all stand around listening to music and kikiing it up, but it's way more fun to have activities to participate in, right? Well, the Vikings certainly knew how to throw a party because they had their collection of party activities to choose from, and it sounded kind of like a hoot and a half until we get to the other parts of this list and, you know, just throw that out the window. They would set up games like dice and chess, or at least their early Viking version of chess, and even board games. The Vikings also had this super fun drinking game called flighting, where partygoers would team up and recite poetry. They would drop some sick bars about their conquests and exploits, and would even drop a diss or two at their opponents, like a Drake versus Kanye moment. Oh, wait, no, they're friends now. Damn. Well, scratch that last part, but you know what I mean. On top of rap battles and board games, Viking parties just wouldn't be a proper event without drinking, and they even played a game to see who could drink the most. Honestly, I kind of feel bad for the Vikings' livers after all that, and imagine that hangover. Yikes.
In our number 7 spot today, we have golden apples. Golden apples are an incredibly important part of Norse mythology because of the fact that they need to be continually eaten by the Norse gods in order to maintain their immortality. It's not just like a free ticket, alright? They gotta consume a lot of golden apples. The apples also supplied the gods with their strength, as well as their forever youth. The orchard that contained these apples was looked over by the goddess of spring, Idun. I don't know how to say that, so I just went for it. The apples are extremely important to the mythology, and in one story, when the goddess gets tricked into giving herself and the apples over to Loki, the gods immediately grew old and weak, but luckily she was returned and everyone's youth was restored. This led people to search for these golden apples at one point. Like, real humans. But even if they were to find one of these magic apples, you'd need a constant supply in order to maintain your immortality, and that might be more difficult than you think.
Number 6. Viking funerals. I really wish we still did Viking funerals. You know, every funeral I've been to in the last 5 years, it's all been a snooze fest. I'm like, yeah, they're old, we get it. Josh Groban, sure, let's change it up a bit. Where are all the horns? Where are all the flames? I want to feel like I'm at a Greta Van Fleet concert, right? Viking funerals came in many different shapes and sizes. Sometimes they would bury the body and leave stone circles around the graves. That's pretty badass. Or sometimes they would do burial mounds. That's also pretty badass. Vikings were pagans, so they believed that the more smoke during a cremation, the better, seeing as smoke was their way of reaching the afterlife. And in Norse mythology, boats symbolized safe passage to the afterlife, so Vikings would shape these stones placed around the graves. They would shape them like a vessel, or these mounds would be shaped like giant boats of some sort, which is again pretty epic. Beats Josh Groban every time. But high-ranking Norsemen, that's where the fun comes into funeral. High-ranking Norsemen would be buried with their actual real-life vessels. Yeah, they'd be buried with their ship. Imagine that for a visitation. You'd be like, oh my god, how do I even get in? In 834 AD, the Oseberg ship burial honored 2 women. The ship vessel was 70 feet long and 17 feet wide. 15 oars on each side. It was massive. It was discovered in Norway on a farm. So again, the whole shooting an arrow while they're at sea thing, it wasn't actually that common as badass as it is. Because if you missed, well, you just gave away the Oseberg and you also botched the funeral. All in one So, way to go.
In our number 5 spot today, we have Alfheim. This is actually a location that is said to be one of the 9 worlds in Norse cosmology. The 9 worlds are often highly debated, and this one is only mentioned twice in the Old Norse texts, but it is a very important place nonetheless. This place is said to be an abode of the elves, which are a class of demigod-like beings from this pre-Christian mythology and religion. Since its place isn't talked about very much in the text, there isn't a lot that is known about it, but it is said that only light elves live here, while dark elves live down in the earth, and that these two kinds of elves are unlike in appearance, but even more unlike in nature. This gets even more concerning when we take into consideration their description. Light elves are described as being luminous and, quote, more beautiful than the sun. Dark elves, on the other hand, are said to be blacker than pitch. Either way, the light elves are the ones who inhabit the land of Alfheim, and the land itself is looked over and ruled by the Vanir goddess Freyr.
Number 4. Horned helmets. When you think of Vikings, you probably imagine a very large man, right? With a giant beard, wearing armor covered in fur, and perhaps a helmet with a couple of horns sticking right out on the side. Nice and aggressive. We see Vikings depicted this way in movies, television, you name it. But was it historically accurate? Nay, no, false, not really. Well, aside from looking cool, this would have served no purpose in, an actual combat. Unless there was a guy specifically headbutting individuals, the horned helmet was not historically accurate at all. The horned helmets were only introduced into Norse culture when costume designer Carl Emil Doppler made them for Norse-themed operas in the 19th century. So, yeah, false. They just wore their heads. So big Viking heads.
Number 3, fertility celebrations. So we talked a lot about what Vikings actually did back then and how they partied. They partied pretty hard. But now we're talking about what kind of festivals they had. This holiday is celebrated on April 30th in Finland, Sweden, and Germany, but goes all the way back to the Vikings. This night is called Walpurgis Night, or Valburgas Night, or I probably said it wrong, but let me know, and is named after a woman called Valborg. She was born in 710 somewhere in Dorset/Wessex as the niece of Saint Boniface. She traveled with her brothers to Württemberg, Germany, and became a nun. She lived in a convent of Heidenheim and became renowned for her healing powers and was canonized as a saint after she died. This celebration is in honor of her. However, it was originally a pagan celebration called Beltane, a celebration of the return of summer. Viking fertility celebrations took place in and around April 30th, and due to Valborg claiming this date as well, the two celebrations became one and the same eventually. Viking fertility celebrations usually involved sacrificing an animal or two of some kind, and included all of the above.
At number 2, Harvest/Winter Night Celebration. Next up in celebrations to mark on your calendar, we have the Harvest/Winter Night that took place on October 31st. It can also be referred to as Elf Blessing, Disblessing, or Frey Blessing. Kind of like our spooky tradition today, it was a time of honoring the ancestral spirits, spirits of the land, the Vanir, along with the powers of fruitfulness, wisdom, and, of course, death. A little brutal, yet kind of merciful in a way, the animals who weren't going to be able to make it through the winter were smoked or made into sausage. It was often led by the women of the household. They left the last sheep in the field as an offering to Odin, though this varies. It also marks the start of something called the Wild Hunt. The roads and fields became territory of ghosts and trolls and marks the beginning of the darkest and coldest time of the year. The festivities and feasts are particularly joyous, and they mainly aim to celebrate kinship, accomplishments, and the tales of the year.
Last but not least, Yule! This last one is perfect for the season we are entering, and a great way to end the list. The festival of Yule was, kind of still is, a celebration of 12 days. It was the most important of all Norse holidays and began on the night of December 20th. The god Yngvi Freyr rides over the earth on the back of his shining boar, bringing light and love back into the world. Later, Christianity influenced things, changing the god to Baldur, then Jesus, who's said to be reborn at the festival. For the Vikings, Yule signified the beginning and end of all things, taking place at the darkest time of the year. Children were said to leave their boots outside filled with hay and sugar for the god's journey, and in return they would receive a little present. Sound familiar? On top of that, the celebration would include drinking, feasting, songs, games, banquets, and sacrifices to the gods and the ancestor spirits for the 12 days. They even had what was called a Yule tree, which inspired the use of the Christmas tree today.
Number 10, Tar and Feather. This is something my mom always said to me when I was being too loud, boisterous, or distracting her from a task at hand. I'm sorry, Mom, it's just what I do. Mind you, looking back, perhaps it wasn't my fault. Perhaps letting a hyper child eat chicken McNuggets and soda after watching a bunch of 007 movies was not the right choice, Mother. I used to be a big 007 fan. After running all over my house, my mom would say, "Son, if you don't settle down, I'm going to tar and feather you." Well, in the times of Vikings, this was a legit punishment and for legit criminals. The crook's head would be shaven and covered in tar, which even that alone sounds horrible. And then a poof, I guess you describe it, of duck feathers was thrown onto his stickiness. He then would have to run through a gauntlet and everyone would be tossing stones and bricks because, well, I guess tar and feathers weren't enough. If you made it out alive, then no further punishment was required. Number 9. Fines. Surprisingly enough, one of the most common punishments of the Viking era was fines. Nothing deters criminals like owing the governing body some cold hard cash. Except a lot of criminals don't really have any money, hence why they would steal in the first place, so owing money isn't exactly a great deterrent in my opinion. However, fines varied on the severity of the crime and who the person was or what the person was, and the law of the land really. Viking civilizations didn't exactly have a written law and would differ from different lands. All I know is that in Skyrim, which is loosely based on that of Scandinavian folklore and Norse mythology, that when I get fined for committing a crime that I only did because I pushed the wrong button, I promise it was an accident, I immediately pay the fine and pickpocket it back. It's not so bad. You pay a fine, you get away. It's not so bad. Number 8. Banishment. "Hey, look over there, it's Skorgamor," said Ulfric, or someone of another Norse-like name like that. Don't worry, Norse sounds confusing to me too. What's not confusing, however, and very straightforward but still pretty harsh, is banishment. If someone was found guilty enough of a crime, they could be banished from the village, and in time of wild beast disease and, well, other Vikings eyeing your village the same way flies look at cow manure, it was dangerous to be alone for that extended period of time. So some people were forbidden to come back into town and don the name Skorgamor. Grr. We'll go with that. Good luck in the winter, that's all I have to say. That's a tough life.
Number 7. Vicious tunes. Ever had a neighbor who would decide to throw a banger on like a weekday? Or have a roommate who thinks they're really good at guitar and wants to like prove it 24/7? They're like, wow, at like 4 a.m. Yeah, it sucks. If you don't enjoy scenarios similar to this, then you would not want to live next door to a Viking encampment. These folks rocked out really hard and for, as we know, a long period of time. They loved live music, as do I, and archaeologists have recovered flutes, hornpipes, and stringed instruments from settlements. But as most of the singers were well into the mead, according to Arab travelers, they weren't easy on the ears. Like, picture the moment Bohemian Rhapsody comes on in a bar and the screeches sounds everyone makes as they try to say Galileo like really loud. My voice is dead. That would be awful. One account described their singing comparable to the calls of wild animals. Oh boy, that's rough. But sometimes they would switch it up with some poetry, as mentioned, by skilled artists called skalds.
At number 6, full send or no send. It seems like the Vikings lived by the notion full send or no send because, man, did things get wild and crazy at their parties. There was no holding back with these guys. Oh no. I know I previously mentioned some of the activities that the Vikings would have at their parties, but those ones were the tame ones, and if you know the Vikings, they can't have PG-friendly shindigs. Of course not. There's gotta be scenes of violence and coarse language. Viewer discretion is advised. Other than playing chess and having rap battles, they also had mass casualties. They played games where people literally kicked the bucket, but I guess dying at a party this wild is a good enough way to go. Some of their more dangerous party activities included throwing leftover bones at one another with the deliberate intent of inflicting bodily harm. They also played a full contact bat and ball game that would often end in injury, or the big sleep. And they also held a swimming contest. But there wasn't that much actual swimming involved since the point of the game was to hold their opponent underwater for as long as possible. I would have to imagine that these so-called games would just make for a vicious cycle because they'd celebrate something, play these games, kill someone, and then the funeral will have them celebrating again just to do it all over again. What a wild life these Vikings lived.
Number 5, drunk sword fighting and other things. Imagine letting a 2-year-old hold a very sharp broadsword. Sounds like a bad idea, right? Well, nobody seemed to think so when they put swords in the hands of drunk Vikings, which, let's be honest, that's pretty much what a 2-year-old is essentially like a drunk person walking around. Outdoors, Vikings constantly wanted to one-up each other on the strength meter. They had weightlifting competitions, who could lift the heaviest stones, they wrestled, held archery contests, and of course sword fighting competitions, as well as all the games Bree mentioned above. Were they sober? Probably not. They also had a game called Togo Honk, which was kind of like tug of war. Men would sit on the ground facing one another, press their feet together, and bend their knees. The goal was to try to straighten your opponent's legs and flip him over. Honestly, that sounds like a blast. Do you think it's a smart idea to put a sword in a drunk guy's hand? No, but it was the Viking era. There were literally no rules except for a few.
At number 4, not enough chairs. Now we know that these Viking celebrations would often last for days on end, right? So imagine if during all that time you couldn't sit anywhere comfortable. Sounds pretty unfortunate, but it was the reality of a lot of Viking parties. Because these gatherings were so big, hundreds of people would be in attendance, but unfortunately there wouldn't be enough space to sit. To try and accommodate their hundreds of guests, Vikings would break out their longest tables and benches, but usually this still wasn't enough space for everyone, so it became kind of a rule that only the most important people were allowed to sit. Chairs are thought to have been pretty rare, so the most powerful and wealthiest Vikings were allowed to sit in chairs. Everyone else had to fend for themselves, either sitting on uncomfortable benches or just standing around. Now doing this for a couple of hours? No problem. For a 2-week celebration, you can count me the heck out. If my tushy's not comfortable, I'm going home.
Number 3, drowning. Given the naval status of the Scandinavian nations at the time, it makes sense that they use water. It's simple, it's cheap, effective, and there's a lot of it. When a serious enough crime was committed, sometimes people were drowned, or in later terms they ran out of oxygen underwater, tried to breathe underwater, overpowered by the tide, or was left unattended by the city swimming pool, if you catch my drift. Number 2, trial by fire. There's water, now there's fire, of course. Well, if cold water was too much for you, then this should warm you up. Trial by fire was more of a punishment, and less of a lethal one, if you will. If you survived the ordeal, that meant God was on your side. Thus, they couldn't be guilty, because yeah, that totally works. The trial by fire included a couple different heat-based trials. No amount of red potion or Goron's tunic would get you through this. There was one version that saw people dip their hands in boiling water or oil, which right there, you ever seen those like Wimmis commercials where anyway. Walking across hot coals, which can be proven to be done without getting hurt. I saw it on Mythbusters once, so if it's on Mythbusters, that's just truth, folks, come on. Lastly, the one thing that I think is the worst is holding a hot stone or iron for a determined period of time. Yes, how long do you think you can hold onto a red hot iron? I'd say not long. Even with seconds of exposure, you would have close to 3rd-degree burns, probably 3rd-degree burns on the palm of your hands, and long before polysporin, painkillers, and toilet paper. Not a good combo. You have a burnt hand, you go to do that, you know? Ooh, that's not gonna be good. You're gonna get a little sick. Number 1, this is the worst one on the list, the blood eagle. The Vikings were very creative, to say the least. I just had to include this one, it's awful. And in the style of Mortal Kombat, of course, you take a crook, and you take his back, and you rip his rib cage out of his back. It was cut out from the chest and positioned in such a way that it looked like an eagle with its wings flying, just, you know, with a lot of blood, hence the blood eagle. After that amount of carnage, you would bleed out and experience excruciating pain. Not as common as other things on this list, it was saved for the worst of the worst, but yeah, it is the worst. No thank you.